10 seconds and you'll be on. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 9th seminar in the Deakin Science Society Network Healthy Futures series. My name is Professor Jeff Craig, and I lead the Early Life Epigenetics group within the Impact Institute at the School of Medicine at Deakin University. I also lead the Gene Equality Deakin University Research Network. My colleague, Associate Professor Neera Bhatia, and I are the organizers of this Healthy Futures seminar series. A bit about the Science and Society Network first. It was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social science researchers need to work together to meet the great challenges of this century. No single academic field can bring about the changes we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems that we all face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers across the university who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. It's such an important area that's neglected by many other universities. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Let's pause to learn, acknowledge, and celebrate their ancient histories and cultures. I myself am a guest on Wadawurrung country, which is 10,000 square kilometres, which covers a large area of land west and southwest of Melbourne, or Naarm, and includes Deakin's, at least 2 of Deakin's campuses at the waterfront in Geelong, or Geelong, and also where I am at the moment in Waurn Ponds. For those who have not attended one of our seminars so far, a quick rundown on the structure. I'll introduce our main speaker, Alfred Deakin Professor Emma Kowal. Emma will present for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have some discussant comments from Associate Professor Stephanie Gilbert and Professor Anthony Hannan before we throw to a general discussion and Q&A from the audience, which will be approximately between 11 and 11:30. I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom. My colleagues, Karina Traits and Tyler King, will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear and answer your questions. So please either post questions into the YouTube chat, send to us on Twitter at SSN Deakin. Make sure you use the hashtags #SSN Seminar and #HealthyFutures, or even email to us at ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. This seminar really is enhanced by your questions, and feel free to ask any questions you want. So first up, I'm delighted to introduce Emma Kowal, who's the Alfred Deakin Professor of Anthropology and Deputy Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. She is a cultural and medical anthropologist who previously worked as a medical doctor and public health researcher in Indigenous health in the Northern Territory before completing her PhD in 2007. Her research interests lie at the intersection of science and technology studies, or STS, Indigenous studies, and anthropology. She is the current president of the Society for Social Studies of Science, or S, and sits on the Australian Health Ethics Committee and the Health Research Impact Committee of the National Health and Medical Research Council. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction, and also for organising it and hosting this seminar. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the owners of where I'm speaking to you from today in Naarm, Melbourne. And I will start on this seminar. So the title, Indigenous Australians and Epigenetic Science, Hope, Hype, and Maybe Missed Opportunity. So the first thing to say is that this is a collaborative project. This is a ARC project, Australian Research Council funded project, and it the chief investigators are myself, Professor Megan Warren, who's down here, Associate Professor Maurizio Maloney, and we have our wonderful postdoctoral researcher, Jaya Keeney, who is now a lecturer in gender studies at the University of Melbourne. Henrietta Byrne, or Hetty, is was our PhD student, who's both of these early career researchers doing amazing, fabulous work. And we also had a Dr. Yoko Asakawa, paediatrician, who was doing some work with us as part of her ANU Masters. So even though it's just me presenting, this is giving an overview of a piece of work that many of us are involved with, and please do keep an eye out for Jaya and Hetty's presentations that will be, I'm sure, in future seminar series around the country and internationally. And the other thing to say straight up is that this was very much a COVID project. So we got funding in 2019, at the end of 2019. Jaya, our postdoc, actually moved down to Melbourne and began in February 2020. And within a few weeks, we were in lockdown in Melbourne and continued to be in lockdown for really the whole remainder of the project. So it was incredibly challenging, and particularly for Jaya and Hetty, who were both doing their postdoc and their PhD on a project which had to pivot to being basically over Zoom. So yeah, it was very challenging, and they were just so amazing to work with. And so yeah, it really shows us what is possible to do, but also to acknowledge the incredibly difficult circumstances, particularly in the east coast of Australia the last couple of years. So to get to the topic that we're going to talk about, the content. So epigenetics, it does have quite an exciting aura to it, but actually Jeff might and Tony might not like me saying this, but it's kind of pretty boring if you get to the basics of it. So what epigenetics is the science of gene regulation and gene expression. So, and I'm just going to do a bit of a primer because, I don't assume that anyone watching or listening necessarily knows about epigenetics. So this will just be pretty brief. So we all have the same DNA in all of our cells. So this is one chromosome. The nucleus of every cell in our body has more or less the same DNA. But all of our cells across our body are very different. So skin cells are very different from heart cells, from eye cells, but they all have the same instructions, the same DNA. So what actually enables the body to express different parts of the DNA in different cells is epigenetic mechanisms. So these are things that turn the DNA on and off. So the DNA is wrapped up very, very tightly in this chromosome and only can be expressed into a protein when it's open. And so epigenetic mechanisms are the things that open up this tightly coiled DNA and allow it to actually be expressed and turn into the proteins that we need for a heart cell. So it's super interesting, but it's not super exciting, I suppose. It's something that you learn about in biology. So this is just one of the projects that have mapped all the different proteins that are expressed in different organs of the body. And that is epigenetics. But then there is environmental epigenetics. So this is when things get a little bit more interesting. So this is not just about the biological mechanism that we need in order to actually be an organism, not just like a lump of cells that are disorganized. But we also can be affected by our environment. And environment, when geneticists use that word, It means basically everything that's outside a cell, or even everything that's outside a genome. So that could be medications, food, things like smoking or alcohol use, how much sun you get, your mood, stress. All of these things are out the environment, and they also affect gene regulation. So these turning on and off of genes are affected by our external environment and can cause disease, or they can cause resistance to disease. And then it gets even more exciting and interesting. Epigenetics can get a bit even more charismatic when we think about how changes might be inherited across generations. So this is just a diagram that shows the epigenetic inheritance that we know happens in humans, and this is up to 3 generations. So if we have a woman who, and this is an example of smoking in pregnancy, which actually illustrates one of the issues with epigenetics, the way it gets discussed within science and in the public sphere, that it's often ends up being policing women's bodies and policing women's behaviour, particularly pregnant women. So this is the kind of example that's given. So a woman does something while she's pregnant. If she's pregnant with a baby girl, then that baby girl has eggs in her ovaries that are there within the fetus. And then when that child becomes an adult, and then has a child, the eggs that were in that fetus then become the second generation of the fetus, and those epigenetic changes from the grandmother can affect the grandchild, granddaughter or grandson, or any gendered of the grandchild. So that has certainly made epigenetics much more interesting to the general public and to science and to people within policy. And then it gets even more exciting, and I'm going to go here to work that is, I think, from the lab of Aded Rehani, who is Rehavi, sorry, who is one of the previous speakers in this actual series. And he is an epigeneticist who works on nematodes, little worms. So you can see these little worms. And when we look at worms, we can find that epigenetic change actually sticks around for many generations. So depending on what the change is, it could be 7 generations, it could be 14 generations. So in the case of these organisms, the epigenetic changes are not just happening to a fetus or to eggs within a fetus, ovum within a fetus, which then will become a child in the next generation, but it's actually being inherited through each generation, continuing on. So this hasn't been proven yet, or it hasn't been proven in humans, although there is speculation. It's been proven in quite a lot of other animals, and it may or may not be the case in humans that epigenetic changes are inherited over more than 3 generations. But at this stage, you can see that epigenetics is pretty interesting because it allows a way to understand how changes in our environment might be passed down through many generations. So this is where this has been picked up by Indigenous people around the world, in the Americas, in Australia, and in New Zealand. And you can kind of see why. So beginning around a little over 10 years ago, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous leaders began to talk about epigenetics as a way to explain transgenerational trauma. So this is by Karina Walters, probably the most famous paper that's been cited hundreds of times. And there's a quote from Lakota elder and also an article from the Native American Press. So the idea, the experience of historical trauma and transgenerational trauma is something that Indigenous people all around the world are very familiar with, something, unfortunately, that events like the Trail of Tears, the Stolen Generations, and just the genocide of the frontier, and ongoing racism and oppression mean that Indigenous people do experience a high level of trauma, and they do experience that this is passed down through the generations. And epigenetics appears or potentially provides a biological mechanism for that. Here's just another image from an artist that shows how many different kinds of intergenerational trauma can affect people in the present. And the work from this, I should mention, has been really influenced by some research on some really important historical traumas, including the famines in Europe and also the Holocaust. So Rachel Yehuda in 2015, she's a researcher in the US, made international headlines with a small study of the descendants of Holocaust survivors, showing that they had epigenetic changes. And the study has been criticised for various reasons, but the publicity and the kind of global media response to it was quite tremendous, and I think shows how compelling the idea is that epigenetic changes as the biological mechanism for intergenerational trauma is what I call it's charismatic, that it's a scientific mechanism and a scientific field that generates a lot of attention. Now, this is also the case within Australian Indigenous world's leaders and researchers. So this is just one example, and again around that same time, where this is Justin Muhammad, who's still a very important Aboriginal leader, but it was at the time the chair of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, the peak body for Aboriginal community controlled health services. And he says that it's very scary to think that an individual event or a multitude of events or the environment you're raised in can actually switch off your potential of what you could be. On the other side, I think it's very encouraging to think that there might be some minor adjustments which can actually switch on, so you reach your potential. So here in Justin Muhammad's quote, we really see both the promise and the devastating implications of epigenetics. That if we think of epigenetics as the biological mechanism for trauma, that it gives us a mental picture of this switching on and switching off genes. And it's devastating that a historical traumatic event can then have these reverberations through so many generations. But there's also hope if those changes can be stopped through an intervention. So we can see there's some really important tensions in the way that epigenetics is thought of. And this is another project, again, around that, time in the, particularly around 10 to 5 years ago now. They're bringing them home, Healing Our Past, Build Our Future project, which was run by the Healing Foundation. So the Healing Foundation is it's a non-government organisation that's Indigenous controlled and run, and about supporting people who have survived the stolen generations. And they also have been very interested in epigenetics. So in their project, in those materials, historical trauma, epigenetics, and neuroepigenetics are drawn on to address the impacts of trauma, not only for survivors, but for their descendants and communities. So with this kind of interest and background is why Megan and Maurizio and I wanted to do this project. Oh, here's just one more example that there's the idea of epigenetics is been taken up in a lot of really creative ways. So this is just a final example from Canada, and it's a group of artists and creatives who are First Nations and who've created blood memory, which is a augmented and virtual reality product to connect people with their land in order to stimulate blood memory and walk away with a sense of connection to the land, to reconnect and to kind of awaken the connections to land that are contained within this idea of blood memory. And blood memory, Stephanie Gilbert, who's going to be giving some comments after this, has done some work on this concept, but it's another one that epigenetics is often kind of juxtaposed with. So to look at this kind of really interesting overlap, juxtaposition of science and politics and experience of material life, the group, despite COVID, we went ahead and we conducted 28 interviews to explore how participants understood and engaged with epigenetics and or intergenerational trauma. These were a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and they were all people who are engaging with epigenetics in their work. So they were geneticists, epigeneticists, people from the field of DOHAD, which is the developmental origins of health and disease, people with a medical background, Indigenous health, and also paediatricians, social work, midwifery, education, psychology, neuroscience. So we really had a wide range of people, all of whom had engaged or thought about epigenetics in relation to Indigenous people in Australia. And we also did manage to do some participant observation at some online conferences. So I just want to talk here that there's various publications that have come out and are in the works, which are looking more deeply at specific areas that we found. But I just want to here give an overview of our main findings and some of the potential consequences. Okay, so firstly, the appeal of epigenetics, which was, as you saw, what started us doing this project in the first place. And what I didn't mention is that genetics for Indigenous people has often been seen as very problematic. This is something that maybe people who are listening are already familiar with. Hopefully you are, because I didn't really go through that. But genetics as a field has been associated with, is strongly associated with things like eugenics, with blood quantum rules imposed by the government, and with basically government control over Indigenous people, and ultimately, of course, the Holocaust, which was very much about the genetic inferiority of Jewish people. So genetics has a lot of historical baggage, and epigenetics is often seen as a way to kind of escape that baggage, because we're looking at gene expression. So one of the participants, an epigeneticist, the thing I love about epigenetic research is that there's potential for methylation to be reversed. With genetics, you're born and there's nothing you can do. You're born with your genes, but at least with epigenetics, there's room to change. And someone else talked about a glimmer of hope that you can move forward. So epigenetics, particularly if we think of it as reversible, is seen as a hopeful science. Another aspect of the appeal of epigenetics was that it resonates with an Indigenous worldview. So one geneticist has said, the people I talk to who are all themselves Indigenous have some kind of understanding of epigenetics more than genetics, because epigenetics sounds like stories. It sounds like something that really is, that can be passed on from a generation to another and changed. So yeah, there is a sense that that narrative of the inheritance of the environment resonates, some people think, with Indigenous understandings, Indigenous connections to land and body and history. And this kind of equates to then providing an explanation for transgenerational trauma. All right, so the next aspect I just want to highlight is that epigenetics was seen as something that could be useful for making arguments about Indigenous, about interventions and the investments that need to be made in Indigenous health. So it's a high status form of knowledge that many saw as useful for motivating policy. So one person said, epigenetics is kind of popular at the moment and that filters through to the media. But then that's tempered by the concern that people think epigenetics is going to be the root cause of everything, which I think is not the case either. It's just having the extra evidence, someone else said. Psychologists tell me, well, if we can get some molecular evidence there as well to kind of back us up, that stress we can get under the skin and literally change the genes. So there was hope that epigenetics might help to better explain, to better convince policymakers that Indigenous experiences of trauma and transgenerational trauma were real. Okay, now what I touched on before, the contrast between epigenetics and genetics was seen as really important. Both that epigenetics is different from genetics and in some ways conceptually might be seen as the opposite, because instead of genes being fixed throughout your whole life, they can change. But it's also seen as maybe too close to genetics, even associated, because it's the same, mostly the same word, genetics. So we had kind of a mix of both of those views. So we had one epigeneticist saying, I would not touch genetics with a barge pole, but epigenetics is for them different. Someone else said, we can't address epigenetics unless we have a bit of genomic understanding of communities around Australia. And that was referring to really the practicalities of doing epigenetic research rely on having information about the genomic variation in the Aboriginal population. Other people raise that epigenetics is a bad term because it has the word genetics in it, and it's just so strongly associated with genetics that it can't escape the negative connotations and histories that are connected to genetics. And the other, other comments are similar, that genetics, DNA do have such a history that can't really be exceeded, even if you believe that epigenetics is really different to genetics. And then we had a range of what we have understood as refusals of genetics, and this is something that we've looked at more closely in one of the publications that are in the works. And the refusal of epigenetics was more on the grounds of its utility, like what is this going to add, basically. So an Indigenous researcher said, it's probably fair to say that there was not a honeymoon, but it was a first period of like, wow. So there was a period, I think it was probably around 10 years ago, like the early 2010s, when epigenetics was in the media a lot, and Indigenous people, Indigenous researchers were, just like everyone else, susceptible to thinking that this was really exciting and had great promise. And someone else said, if you can see changes and you can't intervene, what's the point? Oh, sorry. Then there were issues about, does the community really want it? What's the relevance of this? And questioning whether any genetic research was actually coming from the interest from the community rather than the scientist. And then ultimately a concern that epigenetics research wasn't going to show any different kinds of interventions, that it might provide a different kind of evidence for having a safe environment, a secure, safe, loving environment, but it wasn't going to actually tell us anything novel about this. So what is the point of having more evidence for something that there is already so much evidence about? And then finally, we have these reflections in the data about rehabilitating epigenetics. So how can it be a kind of useful knowledge and an area of science that Indigenous people can engage with in a constructive way? So someone said, if you get Aboriginal people to explain it in a way that makes sense, that deep understanding, they'd be able to tell it in a nice story way that captures that key stuff that I'm sure will be backed up by the evidence, but in a way that is strength-based. So there's an idea that if Indigenous people are in charge of how epigenetics is used in research, that it is possible to express the concepts of epigenetics and to employ them in a really constructive way. Someone else said, we rise above the obsolete debate about nature versus nurture and use it as a vehicle to understand how our environment operates on our bodies and our minds. For example, as a baby spirit belongs to the totemic ancestors of a conception site, that's the baby spirit returning there. So our bodies carry information about our ancestors and the lived experience of their environment and country. So I suppose that's returning us to the first slide about the appeal of epigenetics, that there are, and there are many other examples of people, Indigenous people around the world who have found ways to weave the science together with their beliefs and their culture. So whether or not that is something that's successful or useful or widely accepted, I think we have to take each example on its own merits and see what the broader Aboriginal community thinks about it. So where does all this data leave us? So I've got a few ideas about what this all might mean. So one important way to think about this data is that it might we might have witnessed or have recorded this what you could call a boom and bust cycle of a exciting new area of science. And I think we've seen this happen before with other areas of science, where there is this cycle of hype and hope, which then shifts after some period of time to skepticism. Now, I suppose that the best example of that happening is around the Human Genome Project and the promises of genetics. So around when the human genome was first sequenced around 2001 or 2002, depending on what point you take, as the completion of the draft of the human genome, there was a huge amount of hope, of hype about what this might mean. And it's taken a long time, but now we do have some real fruits of genomic medicine in the field of precision medicine. But between then and now, there have been many cycles of boom and bust of this hope turned to skepticism. So one way of interpreting our data is that when we wrote the grant some years ago, it was this boom cycle of hype and hope, and it's actually kind of now completed a cycle. And partly this is because epigenetics, there haven't been projects so far within Aboriginal research that have actually used epigenetics. It's there have been some attempts to get funding, but there's only just now a project that is the first one that's actually using epigenetics. So in some ways we'll have to see what that leads to. I think another point to take from this data is that the role of scientific novelty might be limited within Indigenous health research. Without a clear relevance for clinical practice or for public health interventions, I think that there is a kind of limited attention span for something that might help, but again, it needs to be translated into actual clear interventions. Otherwise, I think as we can see, a lot of our participants really question the usefulness of it. I think also the question of a name change might be something to think about. If researchers or anyone wants to actually distinguish epigenetics from genetics, so and that really becomes almost a philosophical question about is epigenetics fundamentally different from genetics? I mean, in some ways, all of these labels are merely our own boundaries on different aspects of biological mechanisms. So I think overall the strong links to environment and to ecology in general holds a lot of potential, and that's what we've seen Indigenous engagement responding to. But I think it needs to be integrated and used by Indigenous researchers if epigenetics is going to go any further. And finally, I think taking an even kind of broader step back on this project, I think it's interesting to think about why there was or there has been so much interest in epigenetics. And I think it's we can see it as motivated by the general feeling within Indigenous research and Indigenous health of frustration, of Indigenous communities really being completely sick of all of this government investment and researcher attention not translated into outcomes, and where there are programs and projects that are really helpful, then often the funding ends up being cut. So I think that excitement about epigenetics is partly about wanting more to be done, and also the hope that things might be done differently, that there might be some new insight, some different way of thinking about improving Indigenous health and Indigenous wellbeing that epigenetics might provide. Okay, so I might leave it there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the discussants have to say and also the audience. So thank you.
That's great. Many thanks, Emma. Can you please and share your screen. Thank you. So I'd now like to invite discussant responses from Associate Professor Stephanie Gilbert and Professor Anthony Hannan. So first up, Associate Professor Stephanie Gilbert, Tubagal Wiradjuri, has predominantly worked in higher education since 1990s, bringing a high level of expertise to leadership, research and education with a key focus on Indigenous higher education. Her areas of passion and expertise encompass three areas: critical Indigenous studies, including Aboriginal, Indigenous higher education, scholarship and theoretical innovation, focused upon removed children from Aboriginal families, and exploring the social work practice of Indigenous social workers and engagement with Aboriginal communities. She is currently coordinator for Aboriginal research and development in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit at the University of Queensland. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. And good, I guess it's still morning. So good morning to everybody. So I was quite interested to get that basic survey, I think, across all of those topics, and that summary of me doesn't particularly highlight the fact that I do have this passion around thinking through epigenetics and but really body work. And so coming out of the stolen generations or removed children sort of research that I've done, and really I came to this sort of perspective, I guess, about probably about 10 odd years ago now, thinking in terms of, the body as an anonymous body that gets something done to it. And so I've really looked at, body memory and some of the ways that Indigenous communities talk about that, but also because, actually was about 1994, I think I remember, Emma, that I went to a paper in Washington, DC, run by people from one of the Lakota communities where they were even then still speaking to transgenerational, they had started speaking about transgenerational trauma, and watching the difference, I think, between transgenerational trauma as it developed a sense and a theoretical base within Indigenous communities, and then the other one of the post-traumatic stress disorder development and the way that people, and they almost weren't aligned in any way, which I thought was very bizarre. So I liked some of the stuff you did there, Emma, around, and what came out of the study around, how is it that we get to talk about these sorts of things as changes that are actually within our bodies, but then what hope do we have, going forward? Are we in the lull between storms, or what are we? Because I think the linkage between the Human Genome Project, which you note, and the this epigenetic sort of search, I guess, or examination, that one of the common links is geneticists, and the other common link, I have to say, which you didn't note, is race and concepts around race. And so when I was reading into some of this material, I was quite interested by, hearing from different people in the space, like Catherine Bliss, who went and spoke to geneticists and asked them about race, and who should speak about race, etc. Because the point for me to think about is that at the end of the day, whether you take a epigenetic, genetic, whatever line, at the end of the day, we get treated in these, in these groups which are known as races, which geneticists argue to some extent don't exist, coming from the Human Genome Project. So for me, it's about, thinking that too, whether we like it or not, actions towards us act on race. So it is good, I think, to note that the Indigenous community really wants to know, how do we heal ourselves? And then, you know, some of the stuff that we see either coming through the Human Genome Project or the epigenetics sort of research still gets us to a place where we can go, well, is there things in our bodies that makes, you know, we can do to make ourselves better down the track? So some of the outcomes have been around what can be done to bodies. And so, you know, that puts my ears up again, because I think that was the nature of removals for Aboriginal people in the first place, was that it was done to bodies. It didn't matter who the people were, their value, their, you know, or even the theoretical question, you know, are we humans at all? But we already had understandings around, you know, the impacts of our behaviours lasting 7 generations or 12 generations or whatever. And so, so that's important. You know, I guess I'm saying it's important for that knowledge to creep out, you know, and more societies take on the concept that, you know, that there is a greater impact of our behaviours, whether they're specifically onto bodies or they're specifically onto our communities or the way we live our societies. So, yeah, and just that the healing has to be, for us, I think, you know, to still come back and always be understood as healing that has to happen in terms of psychological injuries, and how do we stop those happening? Because otherwise you just have a, you know, a continuing cycle, whether it's an epigenetic cycle or a something else cycle, and those, you know, things that we might do to impact on things like heart disease or, you know, those actual physical, like medical sort of structured ideas and experiences. So I think I might leave it at that, Jeff. And
Great, thanks. Many thanks, Stephanie. Emma, do you have any immediate response to Stephanie before we go on to hear from Tony?
Oh, just that, no, thank you so much, Stephanie. There's, yeah, so much in that. And yeah, I think that doing like a, comparative study of, or comparative thought experiment of the trajectory of post-traumatic stress disorder versus transgenerational trauma is, really, really interesting. And if no one's done that, I think it'd be really fabulous to think about how the different ways those disorders are operationalized, and what race might be doing there, and whether there is like transgenerational trauma or historical trauma, if there are efforts to actually make that its own diagnosis, and what that might mean for better or worse. So anyway, just some initial responses, but yeah, looking forward to Tony's comments.
Thanks, Emma. Next up, Associate Professor Tony Hannan. He received his undergraduate training and PhD from the University of Sydney. He was then awarded a Nuffield Medical Fellowship at the University of Oxford, where he subsequently held other research positions before returning to Australia to establish a laboratory at the Florey Institute. He's received various fellowships and awards and is currently a theme leader and laboratory head at the Florey Institute at the University of Melbourne. He and colleagues provided the first demonstration in any genetic animal model that environmental stimulation can be therapeutic. This has led to new insights into gene-environment interactions in various brain disorders, including Huntington's disease, dementia, depression, schizophrenia, and autism spectrum disorders. His lab at the Florey explores how genes and the environment combine via experience-dependent plasticity in developing a dysfunctional brain. Their research includes models of brain disorders which involve cognitive and affective dysfunction, investigated at behavioral, cellular, and molecular levels to identify pathogenic mechanisms and therapeutic targets. He's recently been working on gut microbiomes, and he's also been exploring transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of acquired brain and behavioral traits in animal models in response to paternal environmental exposures and experience. So over to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff, for the invitation. Great to be here. And I'd like to thank Emma and Stephanie for their excellent presentations, which were really informative. So I'd firstly say that I have no real Indigenous research experience or Indigenous health experience as a researcher or a scientist. So that's largely out of my expertise. So I'll probably try and stick to my expertise, which, as Jeff said, includes neuroscience and medical research and an interest in both genetics and epigenetics from that perspective. And I think Emma gave a lovely introduction to epigenetics. And the only thing I'd probably add to that is because the introduction reflected really many, many decades of knowledge of, human life from conception, including in utero, and so exposures, environmental factors, lifestyle of the mother, and then obviously after birth, those factors as well, which ties in with DOHAD, this developmental origins of health and disease, which I think is extremely important. And people talk about the first 1,000 days of life, including, those 9 months in utero as being just so important for health and disease susceptibility later in life. But some of our work we've been interested in, and the work of many others around the world, is paternal transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So it's not just what the mother does in terms of environmental exposures and lifestyle, but it may be what the father does before conception, because there's evidence in preclinical models and a lot of animal models, but also increasingly human evidence when human sperm is studied. And obviously the human equivalent doing those cohort studies where you're studying the next generation or two they're very long studies. So not many of them have been done properly. And even the Yehuda study, as Emma mentioned, was perhaps a bit underpowered. It's very hard to get the kind of numbers you want in some of these studies and fund them and keep them funded and so on. But the implication being it's not just the mothers, it's the fathers that convey this information. So this ties into the theme here, which is, I think, that there is a positive message around epigenetics, because I often say in my seminars that we're all dealt a genetic deck of cards at conception that we can do nothing about. Although, some people are talking about CRISPR gene editing and things now, maybe people will somatically on somatic cells try and, prevent disease mutations or things like that. However, epigenetics is something whereby we might be able to reverse it. Epigenetics may be reversible. So if you dealt a not so good epigenetic deck of cards at conception, maybe that's something through improved, lifestyle and interventions and so on. There may be ways of improving health through epigenetics. That's something we're very interested in. It's something that's of great interest. And so hence, in terms of Indigenous health, and it's a major issue, and certainly in Australia, if there are things like increased stress or trauma relative to the general population, and if there's evidence that could transmit not just one generation, maybe two or more, then if we can improve equity, and this goes beyond stress because there's other factors like diet, like other lifestyle factors, other environmental exposure. If there's not equity in terms of people having equal opportunity and including to factors that affect their health, then those negative factors, which I refer to as epigenopathy, the idea that this, negative environmental factors might lead to negative epigenetic factors or epigenopathy, which may contribute to increased risk of a particular disorder. And then there might be transgenerational epigenopathy. But the upside of that, there might also be, if you can have better environmental conditions and opportunities and lifestyle factors, there might also be epigenetic resilience. You can build in a resilience, including resilience to disease. That would be the positive side. And so really that's the general message that I would add to what's been said already, is the idea that with epigenetics comes a positive message, because even if you have this epigenopathy, it might be reversible through, improved opportunities for better health and, improved ability to access positive lifestyle factors and so on that could lead to better health outcomes. And the other thing is, I think Emma referred to precision medicine, and that's partly, certainly from the perspective of the sperm epigenetics. There may be ways of helping fathers who are planning to become fathers to, be able to have healthier sperm epigenetics and help their offspring be healthier. That would be one thing. And then in the children, if there is epigenopathy, there might be ways with precision medicine of identifying that and therefore improving health by identifying the epigenetic causes of disease susceptibility. And that's a kind of big picture that we're very interested in at the Florey. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Jeff.
Many thanks, Tony. Emma, would you like to respond to Tony's comments?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Tony. And I love epigenopathy. I think that's really going to take off, I suspect. Yeah, and I suppose my main kind of comment is around the, a question really about the evidence. And I think I've also spoken to Jeff about this in the past, about the stability of epigenetic changes or the susceptibility to change. So we saw back, if you recall, that kind of example from an Indigenous leader, Justa Muhammad, of saying, on the one hand, it's really depressing to think that transgenerational trauma, that one person's negative experience can be transmitted through so many generations. Putting aside for a moment the question about the evidence for how many generations in humans, but it's also really positive if we can have interventions that can change these things. So, like, the different ways that you look at it seems to me to depend on, an empirical biological question of how easy is it to change your epigenetics and how stable are those changes. And I know that's, a very difficult question to answer, because our epigenetic expression is probably changing all the time and differently in all different organs and parts of our body. But do you think of these epigenetic changes as, in response to, say, what we think of as a healthy lifestyle? So if you exercise, if you eat well, the epigenetics of certain organs in your body will have a more positive profile, and however we define a positive profile. And is there any stability to that then? Do we just have to, keep on being healthy, and as long as we're healthy, we've got healthy epigenetics, but as soon as we stop, then that's it. It's bad again. Yeah,
that's a very interesting point, Emma. And I think, there's dramatic examples, for example, from Nia Anon's group in Melbourne, of exercise. When in humans, they could do a little biopsy of the muscle before and after exercise in the same individuals and show epigenetic changes in response to exercise. And the implication is, I think, from the health perspective, is that, having improved health at a particular stage of life can have carry-on effects. However, the implication is, ideally, for living longest and living healthiest, you want these positive lifestyle factors as long as possible throughout life, because they don't last forever, these beneficial effects. And not all the beneficial effects are epigenetic, of course. You can get beneficial effects of exercise that don't involve epigenetics. They involve molecules and cells, but not epigenetics per se. So epigenetics fits into human health as a part of it, but not, it doesn't drive everything. So there are certainly limits to the health benefits of epigenetics or epigenetic resilience, as I said. But the interesting work is that, this idea of an epigenetic clock, you can look at, take some cells from someone like blood cells, for example, and you can have some, if you like, epigenetic memory of environmental exposures and lifestyle factors. And also with a clock kind of measure, if they're 50 years old, does their epigenetics look like a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old? And in some cases that does track with lifespan and health. And so, there's interesting things happening around these epigenetic clocks, which give some indicator of how fast someone's aging and how long they might live and how predisposed to diseases of aging they might be.
Stephanie, would you like to open your camera again for question time?
Yep.
And do you have any more questions for Emma, or Emma, any questions for Stephanie or Tony?
Yeah, well, I suppose that then raises the, this question of epigenetic exceptionalism at all. Like, so on the one hand, epigenetics kind of suffers from its, in the context that we've been studying, it's kind of suffers in a way from its association with genetics because of this idea of, is it because of its association that genetics is fixed, and has been used in a lot of negative ways. And absolutely, when we're talking about the negative uses of genetics, we're talking about race, to pick up on, Stephanie's comment. But it also maybe benefits from its association with kind of the stability of genetics, because the way you're talking about it, Tony, it's like just another aspect of our physiology. So you exercise, your blood sugar will go down, and your epigenetics will go up. So yeah, when we kind of think of epigenetics as just a biological mechanism that's just constantly changing, it's just kind of an aspect of physiology, then it becomes less exciting, I suppose, in terms of its ability to have lasting impacts on our bodies.
And I guess, Emma, that we would like to think as, that we have some higher order, function in the world other than just being an organism, and perhaps we're just conning ourselves. But yeah, I think that one of the things about the epigenetic sort of cycle, I guess, is the idea that there's perhaps a chance we can do something to, if something has been switched off, can we switch it back on? If our ability to manage stress, or in the African American population, I think it was heart disease or something, is there some stuff? And I think we're more comfortable talking about it in real sort of terms of what is happening in a body right now, and do you pass it down to your children? But also, it is harder to say, how is it, and is it possible for you to inherit a psychological trauma, and what does that look like? So I think it's a very difficult conversation to engage with, because it makes us feel uncomfortable that and anybody who's a parent knows that we have this ability to impact upon the next generation without even trying. So yeah, to think that something we do now, or that our grandparents, great grandparents, etc., did, is observable in us. And so apologies for internet quality. I live in a less than quality suburb for internet.
I think they're excellent points, Stephanie, and this old joke that, whether it's genetics or epigenetics, either way you can blame your parents. But just seriously, I think you made an excellent point before, that genetics, including the Human Genome Project, really has had positive benefits in saying that race as a construct is not really biologically meaningful. That's part of the Human Genome Project and genetics. And therefore, I don't think we need to rename epigenetics, because I don't think, I think modern genomics and genetics says that, race associates perhaps with culture, but biologically, it's not something that's been supported by the human genome. That, there's far more within what might be called a race. There's far more genetic variance than between races. That's my understanding of human genetics. And so that message needs to come across, because that's a very positive message that's come out of genetics and genomics.
But there is certain things that exist in bodies because of the particular place that they've grown up, and so there are particular things to particular groups because of where they've generated. So I think a medical doctor asking those questions is a good thing for them to know, and I usually tell the story of, going to the doctor, and I've had more than 2 doctors say this to me, I have to, you're my first Aboriginal patient, I have to go and research. And I'm hoping that what they're saying they have to research is what are the particular things that might happen. So my ability to have insulin resistance, for instance, so that they can be a better doctor, not that they can, make me a better person, aside from, medically.
I agree. Precision medicine is going to be good for all of us, help us live healthier and help us live longer. And if we can bridge the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians with things like precision medicine, that would be fantastic.
Well, I've never wanted to bridge the gap because I'm happy with my positionality, but I think what I want is for everyone to be as healthy as they can possibly be.
I meant the lifespan gap. Yeah, the idea that the average lifespan is lower is really shameful.
Okay, thanks. We have 3 great questions from the audience, and I'll turn to the first one first from Warwick Anderson. It seems that in epigenetics, environment and society dwindle to that which affects the genome. What happens to social and environmental determinants of health not operating this way? Are they ignored? What I was saying is epigenetics is an honest term since it's centered on genetics. A cynic would say it's a more effective strategy to get Indigenous people to think about their bodies genetically. That is, to colonize the life worlds of Indigenous people. Any comments on that question?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Go first, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I suppose I'll have to. Yeah, look, I mean, absolutely, that if we are talking about epigenetics, we're centering epigenetics. And although it's, I think the appeal of it is that it is seen as something better than genetics. That's the way it's, I think, perceived by some Indigenous scholars and leaders. It's a reaction, that idea that it's better than genetics is obviously a reaction to genetics. And I suppose my comment to Tony before, it's not really, if we can conceptualize, it's not really different from any other part of our bodies that is affected by the environment. So yeah, I think that there is a real danger of geneticizing Indigenous health kind of through, I suppose, to hearken to Troy Duster's, backdoor to genetics. Epigenetics might be a backdoor, sorry, he said backdoor to eugenics, was his book, and maybe epigenetics is a backdoor to genetics.
Any other responses to that question?
Well, and I guess that's my link back to, to racism, is actually to go, worst case scenario, you do something, you continue on a course of actions based on whatever the narrative is that you're creating, whether it's a narrative that we create around genetics or a narrative that we create around epigenetics or race or whatever. And then we use that as the filter, justification, action, call to, rally to action, to then transact some, something usually horrible against another group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the other thing, just to respond to that comment, is that I think from the point of view of an epigeneticist, and I'm happy you guys, Jeff and Tony, can correct me, but I don't think there is any environmental exposure that doesn't affect the genome through epigenetics. I mean that's the whole point, that anything that affects the body can be affecting the epigenome. Is that wrong?
My response would be there will be a whole lot of environments that wash over us and that don't affect the epigenome. So we've got to be very careful about the assumption that all environments affect us and are passed on down from cell to cell and also from generation to generation, because our physiology is set up to generally cope. Our evolution, we cope with a whole lot of environmental insults. There's only some get through. When we do an epigenome-wide study, we found that such a small proportion of the genome, a very small proportion, responds to specific environments. And so the cells, the liver cells, got to remain a liver cell, a heart cell, a heart cell. So the environment cannot wash all epigenetics away. So it seems we've yet to really define that proportion of the genome, which is a small one, that the epigenetics affects. I think it's one of those kind of unknowns at the moment. I guess we've got to be careful of the kind of the environmental determinism, for example, to like the genetic determinism, because we're a mixture of everything. But so we have the inbuilt physiological resilience, we have our stage genetics, but we do have some flexibility with epigenetics, which, especially in humans, we don't yet know the limits of that at the moment.
Mm. I'd agree with those points from Jeff, and I think these forms of determinism are simplistic, and the human body is incredibly complex, and a lot of these epigenetic studies in living people require like blood samples or buccal samples from the mouth. And the reality is the epigenome within the brain and or these internal organs is going to be different, because the epigenome of each cell over time is potentially different. And so you can take a genome from the blood and it's pretty similar, if not perfectly identical, because of what we call somatic mutations to genomes in the brain. But the epigenome could be very, very different. And that's a limitation of taking these cells from just studying blood, for example, to try and work out what's happening in the brain and other organs. That's one of the limitations, and the complexity. You've got 1 trillion cells in your body, but you actually have multiple trillions of microbes, mainly in your gut, these bacteria. And so if you count the number of cells in your body, we're all more microbial than we are human. And that's a whole other level of complexity. When you think about the biological complexity and trying to predict and prevent disease, these are enormous problems, and we can't be simplistic. We need to confront the complexity and try and, from molecular to cellular to systems, try and you confront that complexity in our biology and our medical research. And that's where I see are the really big challenges.
I've just got a follow-up neuroepigenetic question, if that's okay, Tony. So I'm doing, just to kind of just dig a tiny bit deeper into this question of whether there are environmental changes that do not have epigenetic effects. Yeah, so I mean, you're talking, Jeff, about homeostasis, basically, that our bodies are designed to keep going and not just completely crumble. But say if we have an experience which makes us upset or makes us happy, or when we laugh, do you think, Tony, that those neurological experiences or those feelings are neuroepigenetically mediated? I mean, not that we're talking about lasting epigenetic changes, but are those changes, is the mechanism of them that there are epigenetic effects that lead to gene expression effects?
Well, these are good questions, and epigenetics depends how you define, and we're talking about DNA modifications like this methylation that people like Jeff study in particular, and we do a little bit there. That's one thing, but then if you include what we call non-coding RNAs, these other levels of epigenetics and histone modifications, it depends very much on the cells and the circuits in the brain. But what I can tell you, based on human studies where they looked at post-mortem samples, and actually looked at people who had childhood trauma, like a severe trauma, abuse, childhood abuse, compared to controls, and then studied the brain after the brains were donated post-mortem. And there was evidence of these epigenetic changes that were in the brain, relevant parts of the brain, relevant to PTSD in particular, post-traumatic stress disorder, that differed between those who'd had the severe childhood trauma and those who hadn't. And that was quite a dramatic example that that you have a major stressor like childhood abuse that can actually, leave these epigenetic marks in the brain decades later that probably helped explain why they had PTSD versus controls who didn't develop PTSD.
And also there's a really interesting field that's showing that the memories that are made in our brains have an epigenetic component. So it's an extra level of epigenetics on this. And that's really, really fascinating. So to answer your question the other way, Emma, if something, if you remember something, then there's epigenetic. I think there's likely to be epigenetics in there somewhere. And as Tony said, if it's really strong, like a childhood trauma, anything that you perceive as an important, and that includes positive things in your life, are likely to have some epigenetic component of memory. And the big question is, to what extent can those positive or negative experiences be passed down the next generation?
I'm sure there'll be non-coding RNA energy drinks before too long.
There probably are. We should go to the next question. That's from John Noel Viania, who asks, is there a danger of biotechnological fetishism where epigenetic validation is needed to justify intergenerational trauma rather than people's perspectives and established health measures? I really like this question because it mirrors one question that I wanted to ask. Why do we need to rely on epigenetic evidence? Why can't we just help people help themselves and improve structure? Would anyone like to answer this one?
I think that's yours, Stephanie.
Oh, okay. I didn't realise we were still in Wimbledon. Hitting balls to each other. Okay. So I guess the not so friendly Stephanie would say, yes. I think there is a danger of precisely that, because I think when we look at from internal to Indigenous communities, when we look out to how we're dealt with by other people, the medical people want to medicalize everything about us. So, it's about the frameworks or the ontological or the epistemological, perspectives that some of the disciplines or professionals operate and see the world through. So I think one of them is this, this love for a biotechnological sort of colonization as well, I guess. So how can we colonize all of the different spaces, irrespective of how they're working? So, I think what I was trying to say before was precisely that. I think we have to have the multiple prongs, at work at all times. So I don't think, so my comment about, PTSD understandings versus healing and intergenerational trauma, healing strategies that got, like my argument is that Aboriginal people missed out on the PTSD diagnoses, that we were very quickly shoved down the go and heal yourselves. We'll keep doing whatever we want to do, but you go and heal yourselves. And we didn't get the moment in time where we had the PTSD recognition, and I don't begrudge anybody having it, but I do begrudge us not being able to have it. And so, I sort of, I think it's important for us to spend some time thinking about multiple of strategies forward, and part of that is to follow up with what Tony was saying before, is to go, all right, well, if we do know that there are these changes in the body, for instance, from childhood, severe childhood trauma, and who knows how severe it could be. It could be one slap for somebody, we don't know. Then what can we do within a life, and what can we do across a life into the next, generations? And so I think that's sort of the way bridge, about how we structure our strategies back to that, back to these questions, is to go, what do we want to consider within a lifespan of a person, and what do we do to actually, move on?
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, I think they're excellent points, Emma and Stephanie. And Stephanie's point really comes down to, epigenetics is a form of knowledge, but what's the actionable knowledge? How do we use that knowledge to improve health, including Indigenous health? And so if it's a component whereby we could actually improve Indigenous health and extend lifespan, then it's something that should be looked at as a total component. It's only going to be one component, but it shouldn't be ignored because it's seen as something separate. It should be just part of trying to improve health and delay disease and prevent disease and so on, and treat disease.
Thanks. We have another question from Vicky Kerrigan. I was interested in a comment from research participants, in this case a geneticist, who said that we need to understand the genomics of Aboriginal peoples to understand epigenetics. Number one, is that what they said, Emma? And so secondly, because that doesn't seem to make sense when we accept that the genome across socially constructed races is the same, or does the comment make sense? I'm a social scientist, so maybe missing nuances.
Yeah, I can maybe start there. No, I don't think you're missing any nuances. I think you are detecting a quite a serious tension in this whole work around the question of race. And so, yeah, like as Tony said, the sequencing of the human genome is certainly at the time seen as proving that race did not exist, because we are 99.9% the same, all humans, and that there is, well, since the 70s, Richard Lewontin has shown us that there is more diversity within groups than between groups, the groups that we would usually judge to be racial groups. But at the same time, I think that what we've seen with genomics in this post-genomic age, since the sequencing of the human genome, is that race, the idea of biological differences between groups, hasn't gone away. And that comes through in, I think, what you have picked up from that data, that and epigeneticists is saying we need to understand the genomics to understand epigenetics. Now, there might be different views depending on what kind of epigenetic study you're doing about whether that needs, whether you need to know the genomic variation in a population. But what that person is talking about is the Aboriginal reference genome, which there are a number of groups working on it, including ones led by Indigenous researchers. And I've written about with another epigeneticist colleague, Bastian Yamas, about ethnic specific reference genomes that have kind of sprung up in the last few years. So I won't go into it because it's like a longer conversation, but basically there is, a huge, I think, tension within the science and within its public reception, and saying on the one hand, and it's also completely within precision medicine. So within the one hand, we need specific genomic information about Aboriginal people in order to have effective precision medicine. That argument, is made, by, Indigenous researchers and Indigenous leaders within the kind of small world of precision medicine, and there's quite a lot of resources going towards that. But on the other hand, there is this ongoing concern, which you're expressing, Vicky, and you as well, Stephanie, that race is still there. The idea of biological differences between groups is still there, and that it has dangers. So that's my short response to that.
And I think sorry, Jeff, you're muted. I was just going to say that, initially that certainly always has been my concern, is the misuse of that data. And communities, as you know, when they've been involved in these sort of conversations, have probably shown to be quite polarized, one around not wanting that genetic material mapped insofar as to be able to map us into a space, but also then in which we're then not treated very well, but at the same time recognizing that there is a value in precision medicine, if the information were to stay in there. And the companies like ancestry.com or something like that, who then go ahead and do things like copyright the particular sequence or whatever the right language is, makes certain people very nervous, and then then there's this other, and sometimes the two polarizing views can exist in the same people, because the precision medicine to be the best health would be great. Yeah, so.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. We have just a couple of minutes left. Any very short parting thoughts from Emma?
Oh no, I'm curious if Tony has any thoughts on this last question.
No, I think it's been well covered by you, Emma, and Stephanie. I think any science, any knowledge can be misused if people, for whatever reasons, want to misuse knowledge. Let's think about fake news, and you can distort information for, whether you're a conspiracy theorist or you just have malicious intention. You can take any piece of knowledge selectively and misuse it. But I think neither genetics nor epigenetics in itself is negative. I always use the analogy with technology or science that it's like a stone, and a stone's just sitting there, and you can either pick up the stone and throw it at someone, or you can pick up the stone and grind grain and make flour with it. Until the humans interacted with the knowledge or technology, it's actually inert. It's not in itself good or evil. It's until humans interact with it that science and technology has, a valence, if you like. And so I think epigenetics and genetics sit in the same boat, and we should neither demonize them nor fetishize them, as the person used the word. They're just knowledge and science and technology. And it's, we have to make sure governments and legal systems and everyone else stays ahead of this exponentially moving technology.
Yeah, well, maybe just to finish, then I'd just say that so scholars in the social sciences, particularly science and technology studies, which is looking specifically at this from a social perspective, trying to understand science and technology. I would completely agree that human interaction with these science and technology is where the trouble begins. But I suppose the problem is that the trouble begins at the very start. I think that in the actual understanding and of science and technology, like how we have a concept of genetics and why we call things outside the gene the environment. I mean, that all has a history. I mean, all of the way we understand the world has a history, which is a human history. So I suppose I would agree with you, but that the very way that we understand the world, even though once it's stabilized as a fact, it seems like, well, this is just the way it is. It could have turned out, we could have understood things differently, and that might have completely changed how we use the knowledge. So,
but I think I would be remiss if I didn't say, Tony, what did the stone want to do?
Yeah, we have you seen Everything Everywhere at Once?
But I think that is it. But to say that we are, it's very Western to say that it's something only occurs when a human interacts with it. But the world would have a different opinion, and certainly from within Indigenous knowledges and understandings of the space, we are. We are a player, of course, but we're only one of many players, and so to overstate our role in the whole world, and I think climate change is somewhere where we see some of this trying to be debated out. So I think it's very important what that, if we gave no mindfulness to the stone, then actually we're not reading the situation in its entirety.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie, for that thought. It's definitely something to keep in mind. So thanks again, Stephanie, Tony, and Emma, for making a really interesting discussion, which could have gone on for ages. I had more questions. So let's carry on this discussion at another time or a future seminar. So many thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Watch the skies for the next seminar. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.